All right. What we're going to do now is we're going to come back to this model, and we're going to begin to just very fundamentally ask some questions about it. Because this model, as it's set up, would lend itself to an understanding that there are different methods of salvation at different times in history. If you have a covenant here that's based on faith and promise, one here based on law and obedience and very conditional, and then the new covenant looking more like the Abrahamic covenant, only much more so, where you have faith again and great emphasis on grace and love and the Holy Spirit that don't appear to be as dominant in if they're present in the Old Covenant period, in that period of history, then it would lend itself to someone being able to conclude that there's a different way of salvation, different method of salvation. And I was presenting this seminar to a group of Michigan pastors at one of our district meetings there, and we spent a whole day together. And one of the pastors invited a young Presbyterian youth pastor to be present with us for that day. His name was Nick. And Nick had been schooled in a Baptist seminary. That's where he got his training. But some Baptist seminaries, conservative ones, think very much similar to Presbyterians, and so he had gotten a job as a Presbyterian youth pastor. And when during our lunch period, after our first few presentations, he had some questions, and we had lunch together. And as he was asking me questions, I kind of sensed what I thought I heard him kind of behind his questions, a certain understanding. So I said, well, Nick, what is your understanding of how someone was saved during the Old Covenant period? He didn't even have to think about that. He just immediately responded, it was by obedience to the law. And I said, really? That's your understanding of how a person was saved from the time that Moses received the Ten Commandments until Jesus came and instituted the new covenant at the Lord's Supper? He said, yes, it was obedience to the law that they were saved then, and now it's saved by grace through faith. And so that is a conclusion. That's a natural conclusion that someone could come to based on this model and the passages that we gave you setting up this model. That's why it would be so dangerous, in fact, why an evangelical consider it dangerous for somebody to go back into something like Old Covenant Sabbath keeping, because they'd be going back into a model where their salvation is based on their obedience to the law. And now, most scholars, when you read the scholarly books, do not take that position. They take a different position. I just got a brand new one on the covenants that just came out within the last month or so. Covenant Theology, a Reformed and Baptist Perspective on God's Covenants. It got a pretty good review. So I thought, well, that's one I want to have. And as I've been going through this, several things have been interesting to me. He falls over himself, number one, to say that salvation was still based on faith during the Old Covenant period. But what's very interesting to me is, and I've looked very carefully, unfortunately this does not have a scriptural index, and I'm not real fond of books that don't have that, but I didn't know that when I got it. But I've looked through it carefully enough that I don't believe this book ever touches some of those difficult passages we had. The 2 Corinthians or Galatians chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, which are so hard on the new on the Old Covenant. He just doesn't deal with them. And it's amazing to me because I don't think he knows how to handle those passages and still conclude that salvation is based on faith. And it's an inconsistent position to say that those particular scriptures are completely jettisoning everything that had to do with the Ten Commandments and the Sinai covenant. But on the other hand, it still was it was on the basis of faith that people were saved there. To me, that's an inconsistent conclusion. But so one thing I think we need to do right off the bat is to ask ourselves the question: how many Gospels are there? How many plans of salvation are there in the Bible? And there's a very simple answer to that question, I believe. And we'll just take the words of Scripture in just several texts that I think nail this down for us. And you need to be able to have these at your disposal. I'm not sure where we are now. Yes, sir.
Okay, my name is Edmund.
Edmund,
and we'll be reading Galatians 1, 6 through 9. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I say again, if anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, let them be under God's curse.
Okay. Now, do you think Paul felt very strong about this? You kind of get the idea that he wasn't just making a suggestion here, right? He's pretty passionate about this. And according to this, what if Adam had taught a different gospel than Paul was preaching? He'd be under a curse, right? What if Noah taught a different gospel? Be under a curse, right? Be condemned. What if Abraham taught a different gospel? What if Moses taught a different gospel? So based on this alone would suggest that Moses could not have been teaching a different gospel. Whatever that covenant was that God gave his people at Sinai, it was not a different gospel. That needs to be nailed down. Now, when I presented this to some classes, I've had some pretty sharp students that raised a problem with this conclusion based on this text. And what would that be? Anybody here could think, how could somebody challenge the conclusion we're coming to based on this one text?
This is in the New Covenant.
That's right. This is talking about the New Covenant era. That once you get into the New Covenant era, then you're talking about there's just one gospel New Covenant era. Doesn't mean that that's applying to the Old Covenant era, right? Okay. All right. So let's, first of all, we want to nail down that there's one gospel. We do have to nail that down, no matter, even if it still leaves that question about is what Paul's talking about here apply to the Old Covenant era, right? Okay. Now, when we go back here, you'll notice I put the Greek term in here for gospel. It's the only term there is. Whenever that term occurs, translators translate it in some places good news, in other places gospel, but it's the same word. In Greek, it's exactly the same word. This is gospel it's talking about. And it's the gospel that Paul preached. Okay, so let's go now to one more. Yes?
Hi, my name is Yvonne, and I'm reading from Hebrews 4:2.
Okay.
And it says, "For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." Okay,
now let me see if I have here. Okay, the good news proclaimed. That's a term from exactly the same root. It is the term for proclaiming the good news. It's euangelismenoi, which is from euangelion, which is the gospel. That's the term, that's the Greek word from the gospel. It's the only word used for the gospel in the New Testament. So most translations, including the King James Version, New King James, NIV 1984, translate this verse, we've had the gospel preached to us just as they did. So I personally think that the New International, the latest New International Version, which I'm using throughout this series, has watered that down a little bit by putting good news here that other people wouldn't get as, he's talking about gospel here. This is the gospel. And the deeper you go into scholarly literature on this, they're saying this is the gospel that he's talking about here. The question is, though, because what's the point he's making here in this passage?
It's been preached throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Okay, but the point he's making here is whoever we is. Who is we, do you think? Yes, it's in the apostles' era, right? And who's the they? The question is, who's the they? Now, we can say Old Testament, but how can we prove that? Well, the way we prove that is to go to the context. And because this context begins in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16, and goes through chapter 4, verse 2. In fact, beginning with Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7, going all the way through chapter 4, is a unit. It's a theological unit. But we're just going to pick up the immediate context of this verse here. So, who has the mic? Yes.
My name is Ivy.
Ivy?
Who were they who heard and rebelled? Were they not all those Moses led out of Egypt? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies perished in the wilderness? And to whom did God swear that they would never enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? So we see that they were not able to enter because of their unbelief. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed.
Okay, so again, who's the we? Who's the we here? We've had the good news preached to us. Yes, the apostle era, the new covenant era, right? Okay, and who is the they in this context now? It's even those God brought out of Egypt, right? And we're in the wilderness. So there's no question that the gospel, the same gospel that was preached to us, was preached to them. Do you believe that text is saying that? It absolutely is. There's no other way out of it. There's no other way to understand that than that. We have had the gospel preached to us just as they did, and it's those that Moses led out of Egypt whose bodies perished in the wilderness. It was specifically, he's referring to here, the Old Covenant era. Same gospel. So that's absolutely critical, I think, to nail down that you only have one gospel here, the same gospel in the Old Testament and New Testament. And that is very clear from those scriptures, just those two scriptures alone. Very clear. And there was to whom was the gospel preached?
My name is
Yes.
Emily.
Okay.
Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, language, and people.
Okay, so it's the eternal gospel that's preached to every nation. And we understand this in the context of the scriptures we just read, that every nation, tribe, language, and people is not just from John's term period of writing on, but is in fact every nation, tribe, and people. God has somehow, in some way, been communicating the essence of the gospel, his good news, to those people, and that's the mission, that's the goal, that's the third angel is. You could say the third angel is talking about the last era of history, and so you don't have to have this text. The previous two, Galatians 1, 6 through 9, and Hebrews 4, 2, in its context, are enough to establish this same thing. But we're talking about the everlasting gospel. There is an everlasting gospel that bridges everything. Okay, I want now to describe the covenant. Rather than define covenant, I'm going to describe it to you in four different. We're now on the bottom of the first page. It's point number 3, description of the term covenant, specifically God's covenants. And first of all, you have a legal dimension to the covenant. Covenant in Hebrew is the word berith, and it means to cut, a pact or an agreement. But the actual word means to cut. And if you read, there's a kind of to us it would be a bizarre and strange ritual. When God entered into the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15, what did he have Abraham do? It wasn't circumcision in this particular instance. It was to cut an animal in half, right? And to lay the two different halves of the animal on different sides of the ground, actually, on the ground. And then what ordinarily happened, now that was, by doing that, God was accommodating himself to the culture of that time. Because that's the way covenants and treaties were formed and entered into, was by cutting an animal in half or cutting several animals in half and laying their different halves enough apart from each other so that one person at least could walk between those animals. And what usually happened was when one nation was conquered by another, the conquering king or general would have these animals cut in half, and then the nation that was conquered, their king or their general or their leader, would be required to walk between those pieces. And what that was meant to say was that if you live by the terms that we give you, you're going to be okay. But if you disobey, guess what's going to happen? The same thing that happened to these animals is going to happen to you and to your people. That's what that meant. So that's where this to cut. That's where bereave came from. They cut a compact, and so we would say you sign a document or you agree to something. Theirs was a cutting. They cut a contract. And then in Greek, when you come to Greek, there were two Greek words available to both to those who translated the Old Testament into Greek, and then later the New Testament authors. Two Greek words. One was syntheke, which was a negotiated agreement, like, for instance, a credit card. A credit card's a negotiated agreement. There's terms, you sign on that, and you agree to their terms, and you're in a covenant, you're in a contract with them. You buy a car, and you have payments on that car. You enter into an agreement, and you sign that. And if you buy a mortgage, the same thing. It's all similar. The purpose of a negotiated agreement is generally to get the most benefit you can for the least investment on your part, right? That's why some people they shop around, or they see a car they like at a used car place, and they go in and they dicker a little bit, right? And some people come from cultures where dickering is, it's almost an insult to buy something without dickering. Over here, we don't do it quite as much, but some people are very good at this. That's the whole point of a negotiated agreement, is you want to get the most you can for the least investment on your part. Now, a diatheke, on the other hand, which is another word for covenant, was a different kind of covenant. It was more like a will. And in a will, you don't have dickering going on, right? Yes. The estate owner essentially says, this is the way it's going to be. And for you to enter into that, you either accept the terms, and you accept if someone dies and leaves you a certain sum of money, and say when you graduate from AFCO, then your AFCO bill will be paid. And they set aside however many thousands of dollars it takes for you to graduate from AFCO. That's in the will, it's set aside, but you must graduate from AFCO to get that money. You don't graduate from AFCO, you do not get it. So there are terms and agreements in there that there may be conditions involved in that, but still it's a one-way agreement. Or a one-way, I should say, one-way, one person writes the terms to that. And you, there's no dickering involved in that. And so that's a testament or will. Now, which one of these two do you think the New Testament authors and the translators into Greek, which one do you think they chose when they were describing God's covenant and talking about God's covenant with us? Consistently throughout. Which one? It's diatheke. That's exactly right. That was the term. So we think of his covenant as a will. And it's very interesting that in, where are we here? The next reader?
David, I'm reading Hebrews 9:15 through 18.
Thank you, David.
For this reason, Christ is the mediator of a new covenant, that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, now that he has died as a ransom to set them free from the sins committed under the first covenant. In the case of a will, it is necessary to prove the death of the one who made it, because a will is in force only when somebody has died. It never takes effect while the one who made it is living. This is why even the first covenant was not put into effect without blood.
So it's interesting that choosing this word that was used generally for a will had a lot of significance, didn't it? Because when does a will actually take effect? Once a person has died. And that insight was not lost to the author of Hebrews. He points that out, that there has to be death associated with the fulfillment of the will. And he connects this with the new covenant. Now here was something very interesting that I learned from my previous class. there was a very bright student who's taking the PhD program at Andrews that brought this to my attention. He sent me a paper he wrote on this. That what's interesting in Abraham's situation in Genesis 15, when God is the one making this covenant with Abraham, and when they cut the animals in half and laid them side by side, according to the culture of the age in which Abraham lived, who should have walked between those pieces of animals? Abraham. But God, in fact, did not ask Abraham to do that. In fact, he put Abraham to sleep so he wouldn't just impetuously do that. What happened between those animals, between the pieces of animals? A flaming torch passed between them. And what's that flaming torch represent? It represented God. It represented Jesus. That's exactly right. Jesus was saying, I will be the one. If this covenant is broken, I will be the one that will die. Fascinating. Now, Hebrews picks up on that, and it uses a term. Where are we on our... Yes.
I'm Justin. Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant.
Okay, that term guarantor is a loaded term. In Greek, it's engos, and it represents a cosigner. It's actually someone who cosigned on a loan. The one who pays the debt if the original covenant partner defaults. I don't know if anyone here has ever bought a home where you needed a cosigner in order for you to be able to get the home. Or if someone has asked you to cosign. Now you may realize, now in the book of Hebrews, the Greek term and the Greek translation of Hebrews is the same term when we're warned against cosigning for somebody. It tells us, do not cosign on a loan for somebody. Because if they default, here's what happens. And Dave Ramsey, the financial guru, he's hot on this too. He says, if you cosign for somebody and they default on the loan, not only do you bear the consequences for that, you have to then take over their loan and pay off that loan, but almost inevitably it brings estrangement of relationships. Because the other person now feels guilty that they did that to you, so they avoid you. And it's not a good. So there's a lot of wisdom in what Solomon advises in Proverbs. But in this particular case, Jesus did co-sign on the covenant, and that meant that when you couldn't pay the debt, if you failed in the covenant and you couldn't pay the debt, guess what? He would pay it for you. I think that's such an awesome insight, an awesome concept. So there's a legal dimension to covenant, to God's covenant with us. Now, there's also another concept, and that is, because we're getting into more the relational element of the covenants. And the relational elements, most scholars have in their mind, when they're talking about Old and New Covenants, that we're talking about legal propositions here. But there are whole other dimensions. The servant/slave/slave-master relationship is a covenantal concept. And because you have obligation, the slave or the servant is obligated to the master to perform, and the master then provides some benefit, usually to the slave in some way. And you have in the New Testament, particularly, you have the apostles who were willing slaves. They were proud of being God's slaves and His servants. The same term, by the way, slave and servant. That's why some of the New Testament scholars say that really should say slave in order to have the real concept in mind of what they're talking about. This was a slave. It wasn't just somebody who hired on as a servant, then you go home at night to your own home and your family and feed your family. No, this was a slave. And so Paul says, I'm a slave of Jesus. But that comes up even raised to a whole new level. Who's got the mic now?
I do.
Yes, please.
My name is Vicki.
Uh-huh.
Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God. That's Romans 1:1. In Philippians 2:5-7, it says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness.
So here, Jesus himself, the guarantee of the covenant, actually becomes a slave to his Father while he's here on this earth. And he shows us what that's like. So that's an actual, and in this model of covenant, it's the covenant maker is considered a benevolent master, of course. Then you have another level of relationship, and that is the parent-child relationship. And yes, please.
Jeremiah 31, verse 9 and 20. I am Israel's father, and Ephraim is my firstborn son. Is not Ephraim my dear son, the child in whom I delight? Though I often speak against him, I still remember him. Therefore, my heart yearns for him. I have great compassion for him, declares the Lord.
Okay, so it's one thing to think of a covenant as like a credit card. You have a certain legal covenant with a credit card company. You have a legal covenant with your mortgage company or your car, loan bank and so forth. It's one thing to think of it on that level. It's whole another level to think of it in terms of the parent-child relationship. Because if any of you here have parents, you know that your relationship with your child, or you're a parent, your relationship with your child is exponentially greater, and your commitment exponentially greater than your relationship with your bank, right? Exponentially greater. You probably, if the bank was burning down, you wouldn't run in there to save something, right? But if your house was burning down, you might risk your life to save your child, right? Exponentially greater. Well, this, in terms of covenantal concepts and relationships, God wants us not just to think in terms of the legal terminology. He wants us to think in terms of the most profound relationships we can possibly imagine. And he said, it's like that. My relationship with you is like that. And that's why Jesus, if you want to just read one more for us. So familiar to us.
This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
So this was, and Ellen White makes the statement that this was Christ's favorite theme. The paternal character of God was Christ's favorite theme. And I understand why that is, because there's no bond on earth stronger than the parent-child relationship. That's why even spousal abuse does not bring the horror out of us in the sense of horror that a child abuse brings in the same way. So it's a very important concept. Now, the highest level yet that says certain things that the other relationships don't say, even the parent-child relationship, because the child really has no say about who their parents are. And as Valerie let us know this morning, some parents are a wonderful model, really, of the divine relationship, and other parents are exactly the opposite in terms of modeling the divine human relationship. In marriage, it's somewhat the same way, but in marriage, you do have a willing entering into a very intimate and profound relationship of marriage. And so God will often draw on that imagery to say, think of it like this. Think of my covenant with you like this. And where are we here? Yes, sir. Please.
My name is Andreas.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremiah 31, and 32. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord.
Isn't that interesting? When was he a husband to them? What period of time was he talking about being a husband to them? During the Sinai period, right? Because he's talking about that he's going to make a new covenant with these people. They broke his covenant, and he's talking about the covenant he gave them at Sinai, though he was a husband to them. So that's covenant he gave them at Sinai, just in terms of all these laws they had to keep, that the New Testament appears to characterize as slavery and so forth. God never thought of it that way. He thought of it as a marriage, entering into a marriage agreement. And he was the partner who wasn't going to leave. He was the partner who would have the back of his spouse, who would be watching up, providing for his spouse, doing everything possible to make the welfare of the spouse possible. That was his relationship. So that's the way he wants us to think of that covenant at Sinai. He wants us to think of it in terms of that marriage commitment, that total commitment, and marriage commitment to his spouse. And then in the New Testament, you have the similar in the New Testament. Yes.
All right. Ephesians 5:32. After discussing the marriage relationship, Paul writes, "This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church."
Okay. So again, we have the marriage relationship as a relationship between Christ and his church that's brought into. That's the covenantal commitment of marriage here. All right. So what we're going to do when we come back now is we're going to now start laying, we've laid just some very fundamental, what we're doing all morning here is laying some foundation. Once we start this afternoon, then we're going to start getting into some real serious stuff. But it's important that we lay this foundation. And what we're going to do next is we're going to come back after our break.